is generally their stronger foot. And so for you coaches, when you're working with beginning jumpers, do some tests. And you know, if you're out on the field or if you're indoors in the basketball court, take a look at, ask them to do a layup at the basketball court, and just by observation, you should be able to see which foot is going to be stronger and which one that they'll jump off of. So that's the first basic thing to do. Then the next thing is go out to the high jump pit and show when you're starting at practice or the first couple days of the season, it's important just for orientation to show the jumpers where they take off when they're jumping into the pit. I have no problem with allowing the high jumpers to warm up with some scissors jumps. That's very simple mechanically, and is what I evolved the flop technique from. And so once you get to the high jump pit, you can start on working on technique. Before you get there, of course, whether it's at camp or when you're at school, to get all of your athletes warmed up. And so at camp, we always have the jumpers run 2 laps for just a general warm up. And very good, Scott, thank you. And then begin to do some sprints with as a warm up and a dynamic warm up. And so I'll start off with a series of, and all of you probably have your own routines, but I'll start off with a set of running 50s on the football field or the track field, run that half the distance of the infield at 50% rate, and jog back to the beginning. And then after 2 of those, run 2 75s and then 200s, and continue to increase the speed and the velocity as the athletes warm up. Then back to doing calisthenics, and I'm still very much old school, and so I like to warm up with just jumping jacks and some dynamic exercises like that, and then there's a whole series of stretches, hurdle stretches, different positions. I like to get the athletes on their back and do some rollbacks, and then roll back forward just to get some a little bit of stretching with the back, and then a bunch of different dynamic exercises that are pretty general for any sport that any coach wants. Now, if you want me to send you the routine that I've developed with a couple of the other coaches, you can email to Lisa, and I'm happy to send you a good routine that other track coaches have shared with me, and that I teach at Simplot Games Track Camp, which will be held this July. We are going to be able to do the track camp at Pocatello again the second week in July. And so I'll announce this when we get back to the general session. And once the athletes get warmed up, the other drills that I like to do are circle drills, usually about a 15-yard, 15-meter radius in a big circle. And in a circle that large, I'll ask the jumper to usually go 6 steps and do a pop-up. And I'll have them go clockwise for the right-footed jumpers and counterclockwise for the left-footed jumpers. And there are 2 things that you're trying to teach the jumper to do. And one is to learn to lean on the curve. Any athlete who's run a relay or run any sprints like the 200 or 400, when you're running on the curve, you're naturally leaning toward the radius of that curve. That keeps you in balance so that you can maintain your speed. It's actually critically important or essential to lean on the curve with the flop technique. That's one of the advantages for this technique, and that's why I ran a curved approach, is that it would set me up for that somersaulting action on the takeoff, which I'll get into when we start to get into the refinements on the flop technique. But running in a circle, doing some pop-ups, generally with the teammates and other jumpers, do that a couple times. The other drill that's good out in the infield is to do figure 8s. And I would reduce the radius, make that tighter, and do a 10-yard circling to the left and then 10-yard circling to the right. The reason to do the figure 8 is to teach young athletes to stay in balance, and the transition from leaning left to leaning right. And so all this is memory training so that the athletes become accustomed and very comfortable with running on the curve and leaning. And so that's a good dynamic exercise that I like to work with. Now, when you get to once you get warmed up and you're ready to start jumping, for you coaches, the next thing to check with your athletes, if you're getting them freshman or sophomore year, first time that they've been out there, it's the jumpers probably won't know how many steps to take. And so when I'm at track camp, that's always my first question. And I'm open enough and flexible enough to do what the athlete has been using. But after a couple of sessions of watching them jump, I wouldn't change the number of steps that they start with until after I see that if they're running a long approach and they're decelerating on the takeoff, they're running too long. And so nowadays, high school kids tend to run with a longer approach because that's what the elite level jumpers use. But that's not necessarily the best length for a high school age and particularly the younger jumpers for them to use. So As a general rule, I recommend athletes begin jumping using 8 steps. And so what is a step? That's a left and then a right. So each left, right is a pair of steps. And so 8 steps is 4 lefts and 4 rights. I've had kids that tell me that they run 5 steps when actually it's 5 lefts and 5 rights. So language matters when you're trying to learn what different kids will use. Some athletes that are still young and not necessarily mature or coordinated yet can certainly use 6 or 7 steps. But as a general rule, you want to get them to do something that's going to be standard that they'll use year after year. Now, what about odd number of steps? I don't mind, and I've worked with athletes that use odd number of steps. It's as a general rule, most elite level coaches like the athlete to start on their first step and drive on the same leg that is their power leg or their jumping leg. And so I've used 8 steps, and I would drive off of my right, so my first step was on my left. But that's my jumping leg, and that's where your power is. But some kids just, they're much more comfortable with that rhythm of using odd number steps. So, I allow the jumper to make that decision, and I work with that to try to help them maximize their potential. Once we get whichever steps they use, then you want to get to where's your starting mark. Now, for athletes who are experienced, like Grant, generally they'll learn to measure their steps with a tape measure. And most coaches have learned that the way to do this is to measure out along the extension of the bar laterally, and then out in front of the pit to where their mark would be. And like I say, most experienced athletes may still keep a record of how to tape measure and find their mark. Those athletes, which is most of them, probably 80 to 90% of them won't remember their marks. They don't have it, they don't keep it. And so I have them run it out, run where your steps are. Now, when they're running their steps back, the path or the direction that they run is important when you're trying to establish your mark. If I'm starting with a jumper that uses 8 steps, first thing I will do is show them where the takeoff mark is. And so, Rick, if you could put my diagram up on the screen here, I'll show you what I use to locate where the takeoff point is. Now, so right down there below my map of how to find, how to set a pathway or a runway at the high jump pit. Yeah, leave it there, Rick, slide it back down. As you can see down in the middle there, I'm showing an ideal launch spot. And every jumper's different size. We're all unique. And so what I would do, for example, on this, being a right-footed jumper and the X's are where the bar is, the double line is the bars. And so I would stand facing the opposite standard, and I would reach behind me finger length or arm's length away from the standard that you want to take off inside of you, and be out from the bar about wrist length. That is generally a good takeoff point for every high school kid that's going to be jumping the heights, whether it's 5 feet for the girls, 5 foot plus, 5.5 feet, or 6 feet to 6.5 feet for the guys. As a general rule, that's going to be a good mark. And that is the start mark for running backward to get your mark. So the direction to have the athlete run back to get their mark, you kind of need to really carefully watch them, because a lot of athletes will run parallel to the bar, make a sharp curve, and then count the rest of their steps going back. And you want them to run in the path and the direction that they are going to use in their approach. So what I would do is I would have the jumper look behind them in the pit and see where they're going to land and run away from that point. And so the point is you're going to run not parallel to the bar, but at about a 35-degree angle away from the bar, and then out to where their mark's going to be. I asked them to count off their steps and do a pop-up on 8 or 9 or 10 or whatever the jumper's going to do. Why do a pop-up? It's because we change our stride length when we are preparing to convert horizontal speed to vertical velocity and height. And so doing a pop-up accomplishes a couple things. It adjusts their stride length to what they're actually going to use. And it also makes it easier for me to see when they jump off their right foot on 8. I can spot where they are out on the apron. Generally, most of the schools now have artificial surface everywhere. There are still a few schools that have a small apron and a grassy area like the rest of the football field. Just depends on the school or wherever your training site is. If it's artificial surface, I carry chalk and a piece of athletic tape that I'll mark to get their starting mark. So you might do that once or twice to get an average of a start mark, and then mark that on the ground, and then have them do a run through and a pop up or a practice jump. You might use the bar, or I like to use a bungee when I'm working with a lot of kids, a lot of jumpers from 10 to 25 high jumpers. A bungee's a lot easier than having to put the bar back up, but no matter what, keep the bar low when they're first doing their run through and learning to land in the pit. Most of the importance here is to watch where their takeoff is and see if it's hitting where you've marked their takeoff point. And I mark it with chalk so that it's not for them to look down at the ground too. They don't need to pay attention to. That's for us as coaches or his teammates to see where the jumper's taken off on their takeoff. So let me see. I've got a comment from Jordan. Do I believe in teaching the pop to land on the pit or on the track to limit traveling the bar? From my perspective, they should be practicing to land in the pit. And for a couple of reasons. One, if you've got a beginner jumper, I've had kids who balk and who are unsure, and because they've never jumped before, they'll jump off the wrong foot, they'll jump off of 2 feet, you know, and so it's a practice thing to just get them to take off of that takeoff foot in the right place. And so jumping into the pit, making a quarter turn to face away from the pit and out in the back end of the curve, usually is where the high jump pits are located at the end zones. And so to make a 90-degree turn, and they can land on their butt or on their back or whatever, but landing in the pit keeps that momentum going across the bar, which is what the high jump is all about. So good question on that. Now, once you get a couple of run-throughs, pop-ups, jumping into the pit, they can use scissor technique or use the flop technique, and watch it a couple times, because as the jumper warms up and begins to get confidence, they'll increase their speed a little bit, increase the intensity, and so they may encroach closer and maybe get a little bit too close to the bar. Now that takeoff point is based on experience of watching myself, but also watching other jumpers over the last 40, 50 years. And the concept here always is for the jumper to go across the bar at their ultimate height in the middle of the bar. No matter what we make the bar out of, it's going to have some sag in it, and that is the lowest part of the bar, and gives every high jumper the best advantage. It's the part of the bar where the officials measure it, and so that's why you want the jumper to jump across right there in the middle. Once they have got their mark, and the other jumpers, their teammates or everybody else, you can start to raise the bar a little bit and have a regular jumping session. And of course, during the season, your sessions will be focused on different tasks to accomplish. The approach is really the key to any successful jump. Next, it is to optimize their speed, not necessarily maximize it, but to optimize that speed that they can manage to convert the speed that they maintain to maximize and optimize their velocity in going over the bar. So let me talk a little bit about the map that I've got, because this is really a good tool for what I use at track camp. And I developed this over a number of years. I studied Jesus de Pena, who was one of the best biomechanical experts to analyze the flop technique from the best high jumpers at the elite level, both men and women. And he developed an optimal radius of the curve that was based on the strength of the athlete and the speed that they could manage, and their height. And it's very complicated, but I generalized it. And so what I like to do at practice is draw a runway. And so because every other field event either has a runway or a ring that you're bound by, and that limits you. So whether it's horizontals, long jump, triple jump, pole vault, they're all using a runway that's well defined. In the high jump, you go out there and you can start anywhere out on the field. There's nothing to define where the optimal runway is for the high jump. By my observation for high school level athletes, I go out from the standard, you can see there, I go out from the standard 11 feet and then 16 feet as the inside curve for slower velocity or less strong jumpers, to a wider arch that's almost 10 yards.
Dick, you got 4 minutes left. I just got the 4-minute warning.
Yep. Thank you, Rick. And so what I do is I measure the radii to measure these arcs on both sides, so that you've got a runway on the left side and a runway on the right side for your jumpers. And I'm happy to email you this map. And these dimensions are based on a high jump bar, which is how long? It's about 4 meters long. It's 13.5, and it's not a pole vault bar. And I know very well that some schools only buy pole vault bars because they have a limited budget. And when you break a high jump bar, they're expensive to replace. So some schools will use a pole vault bar, and which is longer and makes the standards further apart. But using a standard high jump bar, you can two-tape or measure back from each standard at the inside of the standard or the end of the bar. The distances from one side, 21 foot 9 inches, and where that intersects with 2311, you mark an X on the ground. And that's for the short radius of 21 feet. And then for the longer curve, go out 30 feet and 33 feet from the end of the bar, have an X on that. And that's how you can lay out a chalk, or you can do some steps that are segmented with pieces of tape, which you can use during practice, but you can't use during competition, obviously. So that's how I line out a runway and expect each of the athletes to enter the mouth of the funnel or the beginning of the runway to direct them to the proper takeoff at the angle that's ideal to go across the bar efficiently. And I do this because some kids will do a post pattern and they'll cut and they won't run a curve. Some will run in too deep and then they'll make a sharp curve and then run to the takeoff. All of that is not effective for the flop technique. And so that's why I like to do this for the approach.
2 minutes, Dick.
Here,
2 minutes.
I'll go into this further on the next session if you guys are coming back to the high jump. But anyone have any questions on this so far? And you can go ahead and unmute yourself if you didn't do any questions on chat.
Hey, Dick, could I ask you a quick question?
You bet.
So in your diagram, obviously that curve is set up for a right-footed jumper.
Right.
So in my measurements, would I just have to flip-flop this as a majority of my jumpers are left-footed?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, you just mirror this and use the opposite directions for all your left-footed jumpers.
1 minute, Dick.
Thanks, Rick.
And that X comes from both standards, the middle of them, right, where the bar rests.
Yeah, I measure from the inside of the standards, and standards are all different. So I always look from the inside of the standards where the ends of the high jump bar is down on the ground, and I'll measure out 21.6 and 23 or 30 feet and 33 from the ends of the bars down on the ground. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And then I use chalk on artificial surfaces, and so that's what I use, but you can do tape or anything else to mark it.
All right, we'll be back for session number 2 after break. We'll be right back.
All right, thanks you guys.
Thank you.